So just a couple of days ago now, the Europe for Glasgow, or sorry, Glasgow for Europe, should we say, other way around. um, they had an event with a guy called Pete Foster on, who is one of the public policy editors for finance for the Financial Times, but he has also written a new book as well called Brexit: What Went Wrong. And in it, he talks about essentially what went wrong with Brexit. And one key issue is that we've said since that, and we've always said this since the very beginning, Brexit ain't over. Just because you've, quote, left the European Union does not mean that these Brexit problems just end. They will continue for quite some time to come. And one of the things that we've always said is, first of all, the British public aren't really going to appreciate a lot of the problems initially, but we'll come to learn from them a lot. If people who work in these businesses and industries, they will openly tell you the problems that's going on right now with Brexit. The biggest problem why they don't get a lot of news is because they are highly technical. A lot of it is to do with regulation. And as I have said multiple times, trying to get this across is really hard to a public that, to be honest, the second you start talking about regulation to them, they just turn off. So it is really hard to get across the problems that Brexit is really causing. But I just want to go over some of the stuff that Pete Foster said in that event, because I think it is well worth going over as he talks about what he calls Brexit 2.0. That you've had Brexit, and now you've got Brexit 2.0, which is the continuing aftershocks of Brexit. Because this is not, as we always said, was not just a one-off. Brexit is permanent. It will do permanent damage to our economy. These problems are just not going to disappear overnight. They are there forever. We've constantly talk about, Brexit being the elephant in the room. So we're going to go over some of the stuff that he said in the in that event, because I think it's well worth going over and well worth covering. Because hey, as we've said before, Brexit, until we rejoin, these problems are with us forever. So before we do go covering that, please do remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button. Of course, down below there are links to my Patreon page and an donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can buy me coffee. There is, of course, the YouTube donation link called the YouTube thank you button. There is the Pony Club as well that you can join as well. So let's get on into what he said. So this is one of the things that he said. So one of the things you'll find is that you had one-off big shocks which hammered businesses, but they were able to adjust to the new reality, he said. Brexit now creates a permanent state of uncertainty, which leads to what I call in the book Brexit 2.0 issues. This is something else that when we have covered businesses, when they have been reporting their Brexit problems, they have talked about this constant state of unease and uncertainty which now persists because of these, as Pete Foster calls it, these Brexit 2.0 issues, because they are very technical, very difficult stuff that if you can't get your head around, it becomes increasingly harder to trade with our closest trade partners. And like you say, that is the EU. And here's the thing, British businesses, as we are finding, and I wouldn't be surprised if you start to see this more and more over time, you see less trade from, or at least European Union businesses wanting to do less and less trade with British companies because it is becoming harder to trade with. And you will see, and bear in mind, I think this trend probably already exists, but I will think you will see British companies, when they become successful, they will not remain in the UK, or they will have to open a European office. So instead of growing the company here and with a part of the EU, part of the single market, now they have to actually go and create another office in the EU, because otherwise, well, it becomes that much more difficult you become that much less competitive, and it creates big problems. And I would think, especially for places like Northern Ireland, that would be a big boom, because obviously you've got to remember Northern Ireland still part of the EU customs union. So it wouldn't surprise me if you saw two things happen. One, businesses, when they become a certain size, they go off and create a European department that probably goes somewhere in the EU, or you start to see businesses open more and more stuff over in Northern Ireland because of Brexit. Now, this creates a big problem because you need an economy that works for the whole of the UK. And essentially, what Brexit is doing is it's saying once you reach a certain level, there is no point continuing in the continuing to grow in the UK. You know, you should leave for Europe or open up somewhere in Northern Ireland. So this does create a serious bottleneck for growing companies, growing businesses in the UK that are, it's going to come to a head sooner or later. But anyway, he continues. He said, with the Brexit 2.0 issues, we are now seeing them all the time. They don't make great headlines as they are quite technical and difficult. One example was the deforestation directive that the EU, which states that products that use palm oil and soya, for example, palm oil, of course, you may remember when we were talking about the Comprehensive Pacific Partnership or the Pacific Partnership, Malaysia is now transporting over here because, well, under the Pacific Partnership rules, it can do that. You know, if they have lower standards, they can send it over there. So, so products which use palm oil and soy, for example, they need to have come from a sustainable way of farming, and producers are at least able to demonstrate what forests weren't burnt down, and of course, the orangutans that weren't killed in order to make them. So, you've got to demonstrate that. And that is a lot of paperwork. You've got to be able to prove that. And this is where you get problems. That if you've got these products coming in from these Pacific Partnership countries that don't have to demonstrate that, and you make a product with those ingredients, you cannot sell it to the EU. Or you might try and sell it thinking, oh, I know where all these stuff come from. And then you find out that it actually comes from a product from Malaysia that used palm oil. Now you can't sell that product in the EU unless you make those substantial changes and demonstrate that, it's not a from a deforestation, according to the deforestation directive. You can see just how hard and how much of a headache all this paperwork was, or at least is going to be for businesses moving forward. And I think, to be honest, he is right, labeling them as a 2.0 issue. But he says the UK has now started to have similar rules, but it hasn't tabled the secondary legislation in order to enact those rules to make it a legal requirement. Shock horror. And like I say, given the Tories, they ain't going to do this. Because you will have British companies that have to follow these rules, or at least start following these rules. Problem is, there's no secondary legislation to enforce that. It's not, it's not a legal requirement as it was when we were in the single market customs union. You ain't seeing the Conservatives rushing to do this because their whole idea for Brexit was to have a massive bonfire of regulations. And they're now realizing that actually, if they did that, that would have massive, massive complications on British trade. But he continues. Therefore, British companies are struggling on two fronts. They are struggling to get their suppliers in the rest of the world to provide that legal stations to show that they will comply with these deforestation rules. So, of course, that's one problem, as we said. And now, when they export to the EU, they are also in danger of not having those bits of paper that they need in order to satisfy EU regulation. So you have double the barriers. Again, I thought Brexit was all about me getting rid of all these trade barriers. No, it's just rising more and more and more. He said the food industry might also sound peripheral, but it is actually one of our biggest manufacturing industries, and we are very good at processing food manufacturing. That's just one example. Um, he said it makes it increasingly harder for companies in the single market to also trade with the UK. So to put it in very simple terms, if I am sat in Paris, it is easier to buy from Pedro in Barcelona or Peter in Brighton. The answer is Pedro in Barcelona. And we've always said that because you've got access. If you're an EU company, you've got access and you've Brexited and there was a company that you were buying from, but now you've got other companies in the EU that you don't have to go out and fill out all that paperwork. And we saw that. We saw, if you may remember, a lot of the initial videos. There was a chemical company, and it was the big news story. They were sending their last load of chemicals over to the UK because the paperwork was just not worth it to continue exporting chemicals to the UK. Again, these are the problems that we've got to deal with now. And one of the ways we can do that, first of all, enforce the secondary legislation. That makes, of course, other countries have to comply with that legislation, have to provide that documentation, that evidence. But of course, what we see when that happens, you'll see those countries go, don't really want to provide that documentation or evidence. You can find someone else. That's what will happen. That's what will happen. And you will see a decreased trade when that starts to happen. Because here's the thing, the UK is not that big a market. People in other countries can just afford to ignore the UK. This idea that we were going to be a global buccaneering power and we were going to be this amazing world trade power, yeah, it ain't happening because we can just be ignored. The AI conference that is happening recently, where I did a video about that, perfect example. The EU is just going to ignore any regulation. So is the US. In fact, they already have done, because they signed into law. Well, they signed a presidential order to start looking into that a week before the conference even started. So anything that is said here at this conference, the US will just ignore. But as always, thank you very much for watching. And of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.